I'm going to start by reading a passage and asking you to guess the author. He's commenting on what he calls modern optimism, namely the claim that human beings are fundamentally decent and getting better. And he asks where and how such a claim could be tested. Okay, here's the quote. Points. Free book, I guess, if anyone can guess it. If we wish to draw our examples from the state in which many a philosopher hoped to meet the natural goodness of human nature, namely from the so-called state of human nature, let one but consider the scenes of unprovoked cruelty in the ritual murders of Tofoa, New Zealand, and the never-ending cruelty in the wide wastes of northwestern America, which Captain Hearn reports, from which indeed no human being derives the least benefit. And we find vices of savagery more than sufficient to distance ourselves from such an opinion. If we are, however, disposed to the opinion that we can better know nature in its civilized state, we must then hear a long litany of charges against humankind, of secret falsity, even in the most intimate friendship, of a propensity to hate him to whom we are indebted, of a hearty goodwill that nevertheless admits the remark that in the misfortunes of our best friends there is something that does not altogether displease us, and of many other vices hidden under the appearance of virtue, let alone those of which no secret is made. And we shall have enough of the vices of culture and civilization to make us rather turn our eyes away from the doings of human beings, lest we ourselves be dragged into another vice, namely that of misanthropy. Anybody got an idea? Dan Hine doesn't count, he's my editor. Okay, so I'll give you a hint. It's not Schopenhauer. The awkward, woody, wooden literary style is a dead giveaway. Nor is it Foucault. It may be badly written, but it's neither murky nor ambivalent. Nor is it even John Gray. It's gloomy, all right, but it's insufficiently crude. Okay, my guess is that you won't be able to guess, and I will tell you. It's one of my favorite quotes from Immanuel Kant, otherwise known as the Sage of Königsberg, and by itself, it ought to give the lie to one of the sillier bits of counter-Enlightenment propaganda around, namely that the Enlightenment believed, contrary to all empirical observation and common sense, that human history is relentlessly progressing towards a better state. I guess it was me who gave this lecture a subtitle, Rethinking Enlightenment, but in fact, I'd be perfectly happy with the old one as it really was, and not some caricature that was already debunked and dismissed in the 18th century by the greatest of Enlightenment thinkers themselves. You needn't be a scholar to figure this out. All you have to do is take a look at Candide. The idea that optimism, the belief that everything necessarily happens for the best, is not, on the whole, borne out by experience. It just might have been news to the callow young hero of the story, but hardly to his creator. Voltaire wrote the story to warn against simple, blind rationalism, a warning that therefore comes from the heart of the Enlightenment. I could forgive Isaiah Berlin and his gloomier descendants for overlooking the Kant passage. It's moderately obscure, taken from his book, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. It's a book more often read by theologians and Kant scholars than by the general public. But anyone who uses up that much ink and paper to attack the supposed naivete of the Enlightenment while ignoring the fact that the straw man thus created was knocked down by the best-known Enlightenment story itself really ought to go back to school. Now, in the time we've got here, I can't give anything like a comprehensive defense of the Enlightenment, though I have done something like that in Moral Clarity. So what I thought I'd do instead is to debunk two counter-Enlightenment myths about progress or the lack thereof. I won't do so by pointing to texts. That the real Enlightenment was never as lame as people say it is can be seen, I've just said, by checking Kant if you've got patience, or Voltaire if you haven't. What's at issue here is not a matter of scholarship, though passing familiarity with the scholarship would put out many a counter-Enlightenment flame. Anyone interested in defending Enlightenment today is defending modernity itself. And I ask you to consider the alternatives. They are pre-modern nostalgia or postmodern suspicion, the directions people turn in when they tell you the Enlightenment is passé or bankrupt or had it all wrong from the start. There is no fourth way. What's at stake is a defense of the modern world with all its possibilities for self-criticism and self-transformation. And there I think Churchill's line about democracy can be borrowed, modernity is the worst form of life except for all the available alternatives. On good days, I think modernity is even better than that, but lest you discount me as an overly upbeat American, I will try to keep my praise of the modern within bounds. The first myth about Enlightenment is so easy to dispose that I'm always surprised it gets repeated. That is, the Enlightenment believes that progress is necessary and inexorable. On this view, it's Hegel or nothing, or actually rather Marx or nothing. Either progress takes place with the force of historical necessity, or it doesn't take place at all. This assumption is always implied, though it's never explicit, partly because the all or nothing dichotomy is too silly to maintain once it gets stated, but also because it's clear that either alternative would undermine human freedom. If human history is necessarily progressing, it does so without any particular contribution from the human beings involved in it. If human history shows no progress, on the other hand, every single thing we do is just entertainment, idly spinning our wheels, idly, although perhaps furiously. But in fact, there's a perfectly reasonable third option, as clear to common sense as it was to Kant. Progress is possible, but it's hardly necessary, and it's up to individual human beings to make it actual. Let's take one terribly important example. The abolition of torture was one of the Enlightenment's great achievements. When I think about progress, I try to remind myself that public execution by torture, which makes your stomach turn when Foucault merely describes it, would have been family entertainment just 300 years ago in the capital of any city in the civilized world. I would have taken my children to watch it on a day when we had nothing better to do. And I try and imagine myself saying, "Get your shoes on, darling, we'll miss the drawing and quartering." I can't really imagine it, and that's the point. Not just our convictions about whether torture is permissible, our visceral reactions have changed. But with a puzzling sort of glee, the professional Enlightenment bashers have seized on the Bush administration's reintroduction of torture. You see, says John Gray, just to mention the most prominent in this country, the Enlightenment wanted to do away with torture, and now it's back. So much for progress, QED. Both the glee and the argument, such as it is, rest on assumptions so mechanistic they don't even hold for the natural sciences. Even diseases that are eradicated can come back. If vigilance is necessary to prevent the recurrence of things like plague and smallpox, how much more is needed to prevent the recurrence of evils human beings create? The abolition of torture was neither necessary nor irreversible, like any other action that depends on human freedom. But it happened in some places, guided by the best efforts of men and women who took seriously the ideals of the Enlightenment. And it's just those ideals that, violated by the Bush administration, have led to worldwide protests, most strongly at the moment within America itself, against Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and the nameless black sites that are reportedly even worse. Nota bene the term black sites. Hypocrisy is a compliment vice pays to virtue, and compliments are important. No head of state stood up and lied 300 years ago that his country didn't torture. No soldier tried to hide it. And perverse, as is the reasoning that built a camp in an occupied bit of Cuba so as to be free of the judicial constraint that governed prisons at home, it shows an internalization of certain moral codes that earlier ages did not know. What happened at Abu Ghraib was criminal, and I'm one of millions of Americans who believe the criminals should be held to account for it, first and foremost the chief criminal, former Vice President Dick Cheney. But if you think that what happened there was just an eternal return to barbarism as usual, you've forgotten what was usual a couple of centuries ago. The people who dithered about whether breaking a man on a wheel was a legitimate form of interrogation were not the 18th century equivalents of Cheney and Rumsfeld. They were Voltaire and Diderot. It will seem incredible, but these brave critics, and they were brave, railed in public about the torture of innocent men, but it took them quite a long while to come around to the idea that torture itself should be abolished. We learn, we grow, we make moral progress towards ideals that we can also abuse and violate and ignore. That's what freedom's about, and freedom is a large part of what makes us human. Part of being human, if I hope less essentially so, is being impatient, ungrateful, and woefully short of memory. I've been thinking about this with regard to a much more recent example of progress, as many of my country folk are bemoaning our backwardness or Obama's hesitation regarding what they call a simple civil rights issue. We now have a black president, but gay people in most states are not free to marry. It's true, they're not. Though all the polls show that the younger Americans are, the more likely they are to approve of gay marriage, making it certain to be legal within the next 2 decades. And according to the White House, it's going to happen sooner. We just heard 3 nights ago. But reflect for a moment. The US still does not allow openly gay people to serve in the military, so that in the 60s, when there was a draft on, all a man had to do was walk into his local draft board and mimic exaggerated homosexual gestures to receive the notorious 4F deferment, which got him out of the army forever. Piece of cake, right? Almost no one did it. Men would rather go to jail, flee to Canada, or go to Vietnam itself than live with the stigma, but that perhaps they weren't just pretending somewhere at the bottom, they were truly gay. Now, these were our contemporaries, these were men of intelligence, these were men of the left, and the question of anti-gay prejudice did not even arise for them 4 decades ago. So whatever gay rights are about, they aren't a simple civil rights matter. They affect too many deep and complicated emotions to be simple. But if we've changed our standpoint that radically in 4 decades, the first thing we ought to do is stop and be thankful. So the counter-Enlightenment myth that progress is neither necessary nor impossible lasts only as long as it takes to examine it. But there's another equally unspoken myth which I suspect is even more important. Anyone defending the Enlightenment, this myth suggests, is not just naive but wimpy, unable to bear the hard truths about how awful the world really is. They comfort themselves with empty dreams and wishful thinking, whereas we tough guys can look reality in the eye without blinking and acknowledge its unremitting dreariness. Enlightenment thinkers delude themselves with consolation, like children hanging on to Santa Claus at best, and like old revolutionaries hanging on to a vision of the Soviet Union at worst. We realists say the tough guys are brave enough and honest enough to face facts. Well, which facts? It's a metaphor that's worn out, but nonetheless true. Even a stupid glass of water can look half full or half empty, depending on who's doing the looking. For every bit of brutality the pessimist can point to, the optimist can show examples of generosity, kindness, decency. arguing about the ratio or talking about realism will get you exactly nowhere. Reality offers plenty of cases of humankind at its best and its worst. The only way to determine which is more essential to us would be to peer into the state of nature and see human beings as they were in the beginning. Now, humankind has been making myths about its beginning for some time now, the book of Genesis and Hobbes' Leviathan being only two of the best known sources for Western mythologizing. In all efforts to turn myth into science, from Claude Lévi-Strauss's trip to the Amazon to find a culture like Rousseau's golden civilization, to evolutionary biologists' endless attempts to write prehistory in the subjunctive, you know that it's become almost automatic among a younger generation. This piece of behavior might have been adaptive for our ancestors in the Serengeti Plains. It's all very mythological. No claims about how we really are at bottom or in the beginning are testable by anything resembling scientific procedure. Rousseau concluded, "Let us begin by setting aside the facts, for they do not affect the matter at hand," which was not as high-handed or crazy as it sounds. If there are facts about these matters, we have no access to them. I'll speak in a moment about what should guide our standpoint in the absence of fact, but first I want to raise another question. We're no further along in discovering the facts about human nature in this sense than was Alexander Pope, who, after pronouncing the proper study of mankind to be man, left us with glorious rhyme and rhythm, but no more wisdom than the thought that we hang between in doubt as to whether we're gods or beasts. The evidence goes both ways. Yet, though we have no more evidence for the idea that we're basically beasts or basically rotten than did the Enlightenment, our age has seized on anything that seems to show it with a note of triumph. To be sure, a rather weary triumph, but triumph all the less. I want to ask why, or to put it more pointedly, supposing that people like me, who don't believe that humankind is good at heart, not even Rousseau held that, but that we have good and evil tendencies, susceptible to influence, and therefore susceptible to improvement, supposing our belief is not for consolation, we're not driven by fear of the awful truth and a preference for consolation over truth, need we take at face value the macho rhetoric of people who title books with names like heresies in a world whose biggest risk isn't bonfires or banishment, but a possible drop in sales figures? The claim that folks are bad and getting worse is hardly new. Versions of it have been recorded in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And if we can show, there really are people, you say, oh, the old ages were really much better and we've grown corrupt and our fathers had it better than I don't read Egyptian hieroglyphics, but I know somebody who does and has pointed this out to me. If we can show, as I've sketched very briefly, that nothing can prove the claim one way or another, whether we were born benignly or not, we have to ask, what accounts for the whole of that kind of pessimism? Why does it feel so good to conclude we're so bad? Now, you could see it as a form of self-protection. Optimists spend their lives dealing with disappointment, while pessimists spend theirs being pleasantly surprised. But I think the real reason is deeper and explains why, for example, Rousseau's work, while genuinely religious, was burned by the public hangman, while Hobbes' work was not. Hobbes did not believe in God. Rousseau did not believe in original sin. Which form of unbelief was truly heretical was clear from the consequences. From postmodernism to sociobiology, we are deluged today with a torrent of varieties of the doctrine of original sin. Everything that looks like goodness is in fact a complex form of self-promotion. Anything that looks like morality is a disguised attempt to maintain power. The most eloquent argument for political reform is at bottom no more than the chatter of monkeys vying for status. There really are books full of this by the sociobiologists. The most worthy reform, like the abolition of torture, is at bottom no more than a refinement of control. You needn't read Foucault to hear such claims daily. They have seeped into the culture with the force of self-evidence. At least one theologian made explicit the connection. The often admirable Bishop Tom Wright has written that he welcomes postmodernism because, quote, it deconstructs the dangerous ideology of progress. And he continues, I regard the main function of postmodernity under God to be the preaching of the doctrine of the fall, the truth of a deep and fatal flaw within human nature, to the modernist post-18th century arrogance that supposes it has solved the world's problems, end quote. N.T. Wright, in a book about evil. I often wonder if I travel in the wrong circles, because although I often hear people railing against that sort of modernist arrogance, I'm not sure I ever actually met an instance of it. That's actually not true. I met one on the radio today. A certain kind of Nobel laureate in physics, and I've met several of them, really do sort of think that the world's getting better thanks to science and technology, and that's all you need. But I mean, they're really few and far between. But no matter, I welcome the good bishop's clarity and insight on this point. Postmodernist focus on human failure is a mirror image of Christianity. For Christians, the problem and solution go hand in hand. If our sins are original and nothing we can do will be enough to relieve them, only grace can save us. Put more ominously, at least for the bishops, without original sin, there's no need for a redeemer. Now, Christianity had centuries to work out the consequences of its doctrine. If the second coming isn't just around the corner, you need to work out a view of human action that leaves people with something meaningful to do besides waiting for grace. I find these kind of theological speculations interesting, but this is not the time to talk about faith and works and the relations between the two. My interest is not in quietistic theology, but the similarities between it and the counter-Enlightenment worldview. What they have in common is not belief in God in most cases, but belief in original sin with a piece of advice: you can stop struggling in the world since nothing you can do will make it better. If human history is, as Pierre Bayle put it, the history of crimes and misfortunes, the only thing to do is sit back and sigh. Now, my purpose here is not to blame Christianity. I don't actually think the notion of original sin is primary, nor Christianity the source of it, though Christianity has made the idea feel very familiar in Western culture. We aren't comfortable with Hobbes or Hobbesian views because Christianity invented them. Christianity cultivated them because they seemed like the best explanation of the problem of evil. But again, we don't have to answer these questions today. For my purposes, it's enough to answer the counter-Enlightenment charge that people like me go for the Enlightenment as a source of comfort by pointing out that counter-Enlightenment pessimism is comforting and comfortable in very different ways. Humankind is bad and getting worse. Well, if it's an old suggestion, and if some of us find it depressing, others clearly find it soothing. Anybody who believes it has no obligation to do anything whatsoever. But what about truth? What I've just provided, if you were an unfriendly listener, could be called an ad hominem argument, a lengthy little dig at other guys' motives. Fair enough, in view of all the counter-Enlightenment attacks from Edmund Burke on down against the motives of people like me. But it still might leave you wondering, well, whose view is true? As I've suggested, the question of whether humankind is progressing is not one that can possibly be decided without knowing where we started from, and knowledge of that is impossible. Where knowledge is impossible, we ought to believe just as much as is required for us to act rightly. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. for optimism implies knowledge. Since we can't know the future, we should choose the view most likely to improve it. Original sin may feel familiar, but it leaves us with no prospects save grace or despair. We're therefore obliged to believe the minimum about the goodness of the world that's required in order to contribute to making it better. This is not a matter of wishful thinking, but of conditions on the possibility of morality itself. Now, that's just Kant, the same Kant I quoted at the beginning of this talk, who found the contemplation of human nature so depressing that he advised turning away from it in order to avoid the vice of misanthropy. A self-described melancholic, warm and fuzzy he was not. His argument for the necessity of hope doesn't depend on overlooking the evidence. He knew the evidence, that's why I read you this little bit at the beginning. But even Kant himself acknowledged that nothing will count as evidence for the claim that humankind is progressing. We do need an occasional sign. His signpost was exceedingly minimalistic, but then he was a melancholic, and since I'm not, I see a whole bunch of others. Two I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, but there are many more, and I want to add just one that has particular meaning for me since I grew up during the civil rights movement in Atlanta, Georgia, where my mother played a role in helping to desegregate the public school system. As hopeful as we were in those days of the 60s, far less cynical a time than we have now, none of us went so far as to imagine voting for a black president in our lifetime. No one thought it was possible 4 years ago. I certainly didn't. It was discussed and dismissed. This is not to say that racism was overcome with the election of Barack Obama, nor that the rest of the world can sit back and hope he fixes everything, a tendency one sometimes hears in Europe. But it does mean that savoring that triumph is important and necessary for creating the hope and resolve to go further. I might have thought that my own deep joy on that day was a matter of autobiographical accident, but flying back from Chicago, where I'd been volunteering and celebrating, I stopped the day after the election. I stopped over at Heathrow Airport and bought a copy of all the British newspapers of that day, including my favorite, which I'm having framed from the Scotsman, right? The Scotsman, I mean, I don't know very much about Scots, but I don't think of them as being particularly ebullient. It had the Scotsman on that day had a picture of Obama, sort of, a rather shadowy picture of Obama with the words, "All things are possible." I'm going to close with just a couple of words about some other Enlightenment values. I've been suggesting that hope in progress is primary, but in moral clarity I talk about three others. I have nothing against fairness and tolerance and the rule of law. All of those are values commonly named as part of the Enlightenment. All you have to do to cherish them is to look to places like Afghanistan under the Taliban, or less dramatically Washington under George W. Bush, to appreciate them. But they are formal virtues, and while they may possibly restrain people from doing wrong, they rarely move them to do right. The standard catalog of Enlightenment value is a catalog of restraint, and what's often missing is a robust sort of content, values that actually make people go out and do things. And I've suggested providing it with values besides hope, happiness, reason, and reverence. I'm happy to take up any or all of them in the discussion. Let me end with what I take to be a reasonable nutshell version of the categorical imperative, which was Kant's formulation of the moral law. It's about human dignity and human responsibility and how the two are related. Kant says we're obliged to treat other people as ends in themselves, never as means to anything else. What that means is that unlike, say, tables, we don't view human beings as objects we can dispose of, trash, cut up, paint, turn into something else. But, and this is often forgotten, we also expect that unlike tables and chairs, they have the responsibility to behave in certain ways towards other people themselves. That's dignity, that's responsibility, and that's enlightenment value. Thank you.